Hello everyone. Good morning today from a bit gloomy and rainy Brussels, and welcome to Solar Power Europe webinar series. Today's webinar has been developed in cooperation with BirdLife and will touch upon the topic of solar, biodiversity and land use. What role does solar play in nature protection and ecosystem restoration? My name is Lina Dubina and I work as a policy advisor for sustainability. And today I will be moderating this, in my opinion, rather essential yet interesting topic. But first, let me remind you of the basic housekeeping rules. So the meeting is being recorded and the link to the recording will be provided to the registered participants afterwards. The webinar will take around 1 hour and 15 minutes. And over the course of the webinar, we'll take in your questions. So if you have any questions that you would like to address, please write them in the Q&A box below. We'll allocate a specific time in the end to be able to tackle your questions. First and foremost, just a quick walkthrough agenda so you know what to expect from today's webinar. So we're going to have the first 5 to 10 minutes introduction, which will be conducted by me. Then we're going to move forward to 2 presentations that is going to be focusing on the ground examples on how solar can integrate environmental considerations. And then we're going to directly move towards the panel discussion and have the last 15 to 20 minutes allocated for the Q&A session from the audience. But let me move forward and explain a little bit more why have we gathered here today and why is this topic of importance to be tackled in the first place. Renewable energy deployment needs to be dramatically accelerated in order to tackle the climate emergency, to support the energy security, all whilst providing affordable and clean energy to the end consumers. Under the recent Repower EU package, the Commission has presented a plan on how to save and diversify energy supply, how to produce clean energy, and how to reduce Europe's dependency on fossil fuel imports. The package included a first-of-its-kind EU solar strategy, which sets out a new objectives, which is a target of 750 gigawatt DC to be deployed by 2030. But based on the future energy deployment scenarios, Europe can surpass its set ambition and can actually reach a terawatt level milestone by the end of the decade, which is 5 times the capacity that is installed today. Nevertheless, in parallel, we also face another challenge or another crisis, which is the biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. Plant and animal species are disappearing at an ever-fast rate due to human activities, which threaten our nature, society, and economy. So reaching the EU energy targets and the climate targets while meeting the nature protection and nature restoration objectives, we will have to have the mobilization of land for renewable energy projects. And there will be the necessary to use appropriate tools and frameworks to ensure that the land that is mobilized for solar deployment is also being respectful of nature and biodiversity. Moving on to the next slide. On that end, Solar Power Europe, in cooperation with the BirdLife, also published a first-of-its-kind best practice report on solar biodiversity and land use. This report in particular provides support to solar industry and wider stakeholder groups, detailing relevant EU environmental legislation for solar projects. It also provides guidelines to tackle the potential impacts on land use and provides best practice examples on nature-positive solar sites across the EU. So the objective of the webinar today is to delve into these real-life best practices that integrate the nature into solar PV projects, whilst also discussing this intertwined need to accelerate solar deployment that goes hand in hand with nature protection and ecosystem restoration goals. So now I'd like to give a warm welcome to our guest speakers today, and we are quite happy that you found the time to join us here today. On the panel, we have Penny Laurenson, who has been part of Lightsource BP since its inception in 2010. Initially establishing the company's environmental planning team in the UK, she now serves as Director of Environmental and Social Planning for the company's EMEA and APAC regions. One of her key motivations has been ensuring that Lightsource BP solar farms deliver multiple benefits beyond carbon reductions. And these include enhancing biodiversity and identifying opportunities for co-use with agriculture. Next on, we also have here today Carla Fraun from NABU, who has been working in Brussels for over 5 years for both the European Commission and NGOs on a wide range of topics. Now she represents NABU, which is the German Nature and Biodiversity Conservation Union and BirdLife Europe, and works on topics that relate to a nature-friendly energy transition with a specific focus on offshore wind and more recently also solar power development in Europe. We also have Valentina Lasalas, who's joined us here today from Aqua. Valentine holds a master's degree in European affairs and is specialized in renewable energy and energy transition. And since 2002, she has been senior public affairs manager within Aqua, an independent renewable energy producer that is present in more than 20 countries to support the group's positive influence strategies on an international scale. Last but not least, we also have here today Françoise Versini-Campinci, who is a partner in energy law and is involved mainly in town planning, environmental law, and classified installations, electricity law, and renewable energies. Françoise is highly specialized in the renewable energy sector, and more specifically in the solar and wind sector. And he assists in his clients, including international and French companies, on development phases, as well as financing and acquisitions of projects and litigation before administrative courts. So again, a warm welcome to our panelists, and thank you for joining us here today to discuss this growing topic of biodiversity, land use, and solar. So to start off with, we have our first guest, Penny Lawrenson, to present the insights of Lightsource BP work on nature-integrated solar PV. Over to you, Penny.
Thank you, Lena, much appreciated. So if we move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk about our approach to integrating nature into our projects. It's a topic that I feel really strongly about, as there's so much potential to achieve really positive outcomes for nature on solar farms. Just due to their nature, there's so much open space to avoid shading of the panels. You can see in this photo, great opportunity to create habitats that are going to support the local fauna. So making space for nature has been, a really big focus right from our early days of the company. And it's both, the right thing to do. Definitely, we've got these two twin crises, but it's also a really positive thing from a business perspective. From a business perspective, it makes sense. And I think we'll talk more about that in the panel, but just briefly from a getting permits, company reputation, and PPA off-takers, having these great stories that you can tell around the nature positive aspects of your sites is really positive from a business perspective. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So we looked to formalize, over the last couple of years, we looked to formalize this approach that we have, because we've gone from being in one country to 19, and there's different regulatory regimes and approaches in all of them. So we wanted to have something at a company level where we could say, right, this has always been sort of part of our fabric and DNA. We want to make sure that this is implemented in all countries that we're operating in. So our goal is to achieve a biodiversity net gain on all of our self-developed ground mount sites by 5 years post-construction, or a longer period of time if you're creating some sort of challenging habitat or working in a difficult ecosystem. And to do that, we've developed a biodiversity net gain framework to give guidance at the company level. That took us about 18 months, 2 years, working with some of the leading consultants in the space. And key to that is really the mitigation hierarchy. So first of all, avoid impacts. Everything you can avoid through your site selection, layout design is something you don't have to mitigate or compensate later down the line. Also, as part of that, it's kind of that ethos of multi-use solar. So, Yes, we're looking for habitat enhancement, biodiversity net gain, natural capital, ecosystem services. And some of the planting that we're doing is also targeted to do carbon sequestration, but also things like agrivoltaics and having them work together well. If we go on to the next slide, please. So to achieve that biodiversity net gain goal that we've got at the company level, our target is to have a biodiversity management plan for each of our self-developed sites. That will set out the ecological baseline, so what is the site like before we develop the solar farm, outline our avoidance and mitigation measures, what is our habitat creation scheme going to look like, and what is the percentage of biodiversity net gain that we anticipate that we can achieve on that site, as well as setting out an ongoing monitoring and reporting regime, which is really critical because we can do an amazing job planting, but if we don't monitor that, it could get swallowed by weeds or it could die if it hasn't been watered. So really important to monitor that as well. And guiding all of this is a set of 11 principles that we've developed based on the BBOP principles, the Biodiversity Offset Program. And that's to make sure that the way we're doing it is in an ecologically appropriate way and having sort of the best outcomes for biodiversity in the context of an operational solar farm. On to the next slide. I've just got some examples that I thought might be interesting. If you just move on to the next slide. So on this biodiversity net gain topic specifically, in England, in the UK, they are bringing in regulations that will require all sorts of development, so housing, solar, infrastructure, everything, to achieve a minimum biodiversity net gain of 10%. So they have released various calculators over the last few years for people to test and give feedback on. And we've been using those on our development pipeline when we've been going through permitting, because a lot of the local authorities are already wanting to see this in advance of that legislation coming in, that regulatory requirement coming in. So we know what our anticipated net gains are based on those calculators. So our 2022 pipeline, so all the projects that we got ready to start construction either end of last year or which we will be constructing this year, you can see here that they achieved a range of between 31 and 174% biodiversity net gain uplift in terms of the anticipated uplift when the biodiversity management plans are implemented. And that's fantastic. And it's not us doing anything crazy. This is just standard stuff. So you can have amazing kind of outcomes just from doing quite basic things like species diverse grass mix seeding within the panel array area, maybe having meadow mixes in that area, something that's easy to maintain. And then between the solar farm fence and any boundary vegetation, you can do something a bit more exciting, maybe high density pollinator gardens, wildflowers, tree planting, things like that, as well as incorporating bird and bat boxes, high vernacular insect hotels. And it's things that work really well with an operational solar farm. You're not having to technically change the configuration of the solar farm itself. We also wanted to look and see what might the implications be in some of our other countries. So we looked at some of our older sites in the UK, so between 7 and 12 years old, where we hadn't been aiming to achieve a biodiversity net gain. That wasn't really a buzzword back then. But we went out and looked at if we were going to put those through that biodiversity net gain calculator now, how would they achieve? So 9 of the 10 of them saw an increase in biodiversity in habitat areas. Half of them achieved a technical biodiversity net gain based on that calculator. And of 4 of them that didn't, they would have if we'd known, if we had a time machine and we knew what the technical specifications were. If we just tweaked a few things a little bit, then we would have achieved that. So that's really promising to me, that even when we didn't know we were trying to achieve biodiversity net gains, we were still having some really positive outcomes. Next slide. And then I've just got 3 examples of specific projects that I thought were interesting to sort of show our approach to incorporating nature into our projects. So this one in Aragon in Spain, a 250 megawatt site. As part of the development of that solar farm, we have installed a lesser kestrel nesting tower. This is an endangered species in the area. And over a 4-year period, we are working with a local NGO to raise kestrel chicks. And the aim is that we'll hopefully raise and release over 150 kestrel chicks over that 4-year period, and they will create a colony and continue to use this nesting tower. Next slide. This is another site. This is in Australia, a project that we've just got at pre-construction stage at the moment, where there is a critically endangered bird called the Regent Honeyeater. And when we started doing our community engagement work in the pre-planning phase of this project, we encountered a conservation group called the Regent Honeyeaters Association, and they had been working with local landowners to try and create habitat corridors between known areas of Regent Honeyeater habitat. And so we were able to include in the design of our project a corridor through the middle. You can kind of see on the diagonal on the square piece, the southern portion of the site, there is a corridor where there's no infrastructure, and we will be planting habitat specifically for the Regent Honeyeater, which will link it to habitat to the north, which is part of a wetland area. And if we move on to the final slide, this is a project that we have in construction in Indiana in the US called Bellflower, where we are planting a variety of different pollinator habitats, so low density pollinator and grazing mix within the solar farm area, which will be grazed by sheep, and then higher density pollinator gardens outside of the fence line. And that is going to be part of a research project that a number of universities and NREL are leading in the US. So that should have some really interesting results. So that's just a few examples of the way that we're incorporating nature into solar. From my perspective is that it's something that's very feasible from a developer point of view, something we absolutely should be doing, and which is also beneficial for us as a business. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Penny. Thanks a lot for showcasing a bit of the idea of how company or solar developer works with these integrations of biodiversity elements, and showing us a little bit also the business side of these type of projects. But now I'm going to move on to our next guest, who is Carla Frone, who's going to present the NGO's approach towards the nature integration into the solar PV projects. Over to you, Carla.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you, Penny, especially also for that really interesting presentation. So yeah, I'm Carla Freund. I work for NABO and BirdLife, and if we can go to the next slide. So yeah, I will give a quick overview of what our NGO's, or my NGO's vision is for what the role is of solar in nature protection and ecosystem restoration. So if we can go to the next slide. Just to contextualize a little bit, why we're even talking about this is because we need to obviously achieve the energy transition, and we need to achieve it fast. But renewables are also very space intensive, and we have a space problem. Loss of habitats is one of the leading cause, obviously, for biodiversity loss. And so we need to make sure that we're not just protecting the little habitats that we have left, but we're also restoring. And this doesn't just go for renewables themselves, but also for the grid infrastructure that comes with increasing renewables as well. So I mean, we already have 65 kilometers of power lines globally, enough to stretch to the moon and back 169 times, and we'll need to double that to accommodate the transition to renewables. But on the good news, I mean, there is a lot of scope to avoid sensitive locations and reintegrate nature into, especially into solar farms, which we already had heard from Penny before. And this especially should focus on landscapes of low ecological value, such as agriculture and industrial sites, because there you can have the most added benefits. So if we can go to the next slide. I always have to talk about the priority areas first. I mean, Penny already mentioned to follow the mitigation hierarchy, avoid impacts before you, and then minimize them before you restore and offset your impacts. So for us, that especially is to avoid Natura 2000 sites, except for already urbanized areas within Natura 2000 sites for solar. And I'm mentioning this here because if we're talking about ecosystem protection and restoration, then avoiding highly sensitive habitats is the first step to actually creating an added value there, because those areas are protected for a reason and should be left alone for the most part. And then, of course, generally look towards already urbanized environments, rooftops, parking lots along highways, etc. And then when you're building in those environments, you always have the opportunity to bring back nature there through green roofs or nesting boxes. And then also to say that, I mean, the reason we're having this presentation is because we know we can't reach our renewable energy targets with only building in these locations. So there will be, you know, quite a bit of solar farms that need to be built in greenfields. And there, on my next slide, I will talk a little bit about what's important to be regarded when you're building in those locations. So if we can go to the next slide. So yeah, in greenfield, so when we're building in a site, this includes agriculture and natural habitats. Nature needs to be included in all the steps of the process, so site selection, design, and the maintenance process. So I mean, this includes, and Penny already mentioned a lot of really good examples, for example, including hedges along the fencing of the solar farm to ensure for perch locations. Make sure that the total sealed area does not exceed 1%, so that you can have enough, so they don't have intense runoff. And then the fencing, if you're fencing your solar farm, to make sure that small mammals and larger mammals can pass through. This can be done with sort of a certain size of mesh density. And then also ensuring that there's that not too much space is covered, but also not no space at all, so that you have sort of the creation of microclimates, which really enhances species diversity, as we can already see in some initial studies on this. And in the pictures, you can see a pollinator-friendly farm, especially when you're reintegrating plants and other species into the habitat. You should always make sure that you're integrating native flora and fauna, and that it's not something that's being brought in from another location, because this will obviously bring the most added value, right, including some nest boxes. And in terms of agrivoltaics, it's always important to ensure that you can still have the same amount of yield, but I know that especially in some areas where heat is a big problem, agrivoltaics can actually increase yield in that area. So it's all about site selection, design, and the maintenance process. So for that, on the maintenance process, monitoring is incredibly important, so that we can see, are the species recovering in the area, are they not? And then also in terms of how do you treat the area, make sure that there's no fertilization or pesticide use in the area, because especially from surrounding agriculture, that can be a big issue. And that will really help species recover. So if we can go to the next slide, there's a quick example that we have for a solar farm where a lot of bird things were included for the local bird species. So this is a solar park in Germany. It's 90 hectares. And it was built on an old military airport surrounded by intensely used agriculture. So this is a really good example of how site selection can create a lot of added benefit, because if you're building quite a large farm around intensively used agriculture, you're creating a sort of safe haven for the species in that area. So here, I mean, it doesn't look like much from a bird's eye view, but if you see the little gaps in the solar park, those are lark windows. So they're areas without solar modules, where larks can hunt for food and live. And then there were also additional 15 hectares sort of restored in the nearby area as sort of a compensation mechanism for the pipit. And then further lark windows were added in the surrounding habitat. And then in terms of management, there was no fertilization or pesticides used on the area. And then the mowing concept was added to the needs of the species. So in this case, it wasn't mowed shorter than 10 centimeters. And then monitoring over the 2 years so after 2 years showed that the habitats of these bird species increased. So they were using more space, and that was a really good sign. And then if you can go to the next slide. So the next slide is about combination with restoration projects. I mean, as I said earlier, it's not enough anymore to just protect the little bit of untouched environment that we have. We really need to restore as much as possible, and creating win-wins for nature, climate at the same time. So this can bring a huge biodiversity benefit. I mean, especially if there are restoration projects executed in, for example, old mining areas or whatever, where there were historical wetlands. And then especially if we're talking about peatlands, that's also a huge added value, because approximately 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions in the EU come from, greenhouse gas emissions in the EU come from drained peatlands used for agriculture, forestry. So if we can re-ret those and add a solar farm on top, I mean, depending on obviously if that's technically feasible, then you can, I mean, you can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from the peatlands and create renewable energy in one. So there aren't all that many examples of these kinds of restoration projects yet, but there's 2 solar parks in Germany where, for example, at the Kleinreide, a pond formed sort of naturally because of some building processes that happened there, and you could already see that there was you can already see that there's a lot of species returning to the area, especially amphibians and frogs and insects of that sort. So this is especially something we need to focus on and need to dive more into, because it'll be the best way to create win-wins for both. If you can go to the next slide. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks a lot for the insightful presentation and just showing us a little bit the NGO's perspective on specifically on how to achieve the quality of good projects and showcasing some of these good practices that have been put on the ground. But now I'd like to, after we have learned a little bit more about what are these best practices of solar PV projects on the ground, I would like to now involve all of the panelists and join a discussion and debate a little bit more on how can we actually pave the way towards the acceleration of renewable energies, all whilst advancing with these quality projects on the ground. So I would like to start off maybe with you, Penny. Now just we have seen and heard of your presentation a bit on the possibility to integrate these nature positive PV plants and having this a bit of a business side to it. I wanted to ask, from your perspective or from the solar industry's perspective, how does a business model for developing these nature integrated PV parks look like? And maybe more specifically, in your opinion, is it feasible in terms of time and cost to scale up nature integrated PV projects?
Thanks, Lena. So to take your second question first, absolutely, I think it is feasible. My view is that it's something we have to do. It is not going to get any easier to develop solar farms. We're already seeing there's sort of rising anti-solar sentiment in a number of countries, growing NIMBY attitudes as more schemes pop up. And so you have to be able to demonstrate the additional benefits that we can bring beyond just clean energy generation, which is important in and of itself, but we have the ability to tackle 2 of these crises, so we absolutely should. So there's that imperative. And from a business case point of view, it enhances our ability to get permits. So particularly in countries where that's a really sort of political process and you're not always being based on the merit of your project, being able to talk about the additional benefits that you're bringing to the local area can really help and be the reason why you get a permit to develop where you might not otherwise. Second, PPA off-takers. There's lots of projects out there. They're looking for what else your project can bring. What are you bringing that they can sell and that they can create good comms stories about for their companies? And so things like agrivoltaics and biodiversity enhancement are really important for that. Our power marketing team is always asking us, what are you doing on this project? What extra things? Tell us about your critters, your birds, your bees. We want to know. So those are 2 big drivers. And then in some countries, we are now seeing the establishment of biodiversity credit markets. So this is very new, but the idea that you can, if on a solar farm, for example, you might be able to have way more biodiversity net gain than is required from a regulatory perspective. And so there's the ability to then sell the credits of that additional biodiversity net gain to, say, housing developers who can't achieve that on their site. So that is coming in some countries. So I might have, so I think the way we view it is it's just part of our projects. I know there was some questions in the Q&A asking specifically about CapEx and the cost of this, but it's actually really hard to quantify because for most of our projects, we're already including some sort of habitat creation in our plans that go into the permitting. They're then an obligation for us to implement. And so it's not actually that much in terms of additional costs because we're already doing something. It's just, how do we tweak this to get the best outcomes? You know, what is the cost of monitoring that? But we've tried to kind of divorce that from the other project costs, but it's part of our permitting requirements. So we have to do it anyway. So we just see it as a project cost. Hope that makes sense.
No, indeed it does. And thanks, Penny, also showcasing the idea that it is possible to have these nature positive integrated PV projects as business as usual. And just also, I think this is probably quite useful for the audience and maybe specifically for other solar industry members or developers to just showcase and hear that this is quite feasible and is indeed possible to do so. Thank you. But I'll move on, and I would like to hear maybe a bit, Carla, from your side. So again, coming from the NGO's perspective, can you tell us, are you confident if we can succeed with the deployment of solar while preserving nature and ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we have, multiple aspects playing their part here. I mean, for one, we have this great webinar where we're talking exactly about the topic, and we can see how many people are interested in this topic. So, I mean, that alone is already a huge accomplishment in and of itself. We have a lot of cooperations going on the ground between NGOs and solar farm developers that are really doing great work in enhancing biodiversity there. But on the other hand, you have sort of, legislation coming out of the EU, which from an NGO perspective is really not focusing on the right issues and pinning biodiversity against energy development with the kinds of legislation that are coming out. For example, with the new Renewable Energy Directive, and again, I'm speaking from an NGO's perspective, getting rid of the requirement to do environmental impact assessments. It's something that's really, throwing gas onto the flames of an already, pretty tense situation. And especially when we talk about how important site selection is and important about avoiding and minimizing impacts, how are you, going to do that if you're not doing an impact assessment in the first place? So it's kind of a little bit contradictory. So, I mean, that's the reason why I'm cautiously optimistic and not super optimistic, but I also have to agree with Penny on the point that it's not so much can we do it, it's we have to do it. It's not one or the other. We know the crisis is they feed into each other, so the worse one gets, the worse the other gets, and if we don't tackle both at the same time, then we're going to have a huge problem. I mean, we will already have a huge problem, so whether or not, so it's really not if we can, it's how do we do it and how do we do it fast. And then I think I also would like to highlight, I mean, in these conversations, I understand from a business perspective, we have to talk about costs, but I mean, what are the costs of inaction? And I think that sometimes is a little bit ignored in these conversations around if we don't act, how much is that going to cost us in the long term? And I understand for business, that's cannot always be factored in. But it's something I think we have to have, in front of our faces at all times to make sure that we know the urgency of the problem. But I really think based on, the interest that we see here and our cooperations on the ground, that it's absolutely doable. And we have examples already that prove this.
Yeah, thanks indeed, Carla. And I think, well, thank you for the honest opinion. And again, bringing in a bit of your perspective. I think also something that I think from solar industry's perspective and a bit of wider stakeholder groups, I think at this point is also something of an importance also for us to reflect on and look at where the value actually lays. So thanks for that. But now that we have discussed a bit the potential of these environmentally friendly PV projects, I also think it's quite important to also debate a bit more on what role does spatial planning play, especially when we're looking at land use and land allocation for these renewable energy projects. So I'd like to now, looking at you, Francois, I'd like to get a bit of your legal opinion. So from your perspective, does the national regulations that work on these acceleration of renewable energy projects, can they support, or do you think can they in turn hinder renewable projects deployment? And could you perhaps maybe elaborate a bit on a case example?
Thank you, Lina. Thank you for all the others in the preceding presentations. Yes, we are just a few weeks after adoption of the law for accelerating renewable energy in France. It was the 10 March of 2023. To give the French example, is it a good example? That's a big question. Just a background on this law, you have to bear in mind that the big objective of the government at that time, I mean 2 months ago, and for the French government, it was a long time ago considering the situation with the pension issues they have today. It was a long time ago, March 2023. They tried to obtain a big majority in the parliament, and a big majority is on the right side. They don't really believe in renewables, clearly, the far right and even the right of the parliament. On the left side, they much more believe in renewables, but they have big issues on also on ecology, environment protection. So reaching a law that would satisfy everyone here was difficult, and the result is a big question mark on it. Is it acceleration or is it reduction of capacities, of possibilities to develop renewable projects? The law of 10 March 2023, one of the biggest provision of this law is the creation of new acceleration zones that must be defined by the prefect. Those areas, and it deals with all onshore renewable projects, not only solar. It will be mostly onshore wind, clearly. It also deals with solar, but not only. Those areas must be proposed by the local municipalities after discussion with the population, and then it goes up to the prefect of department, which will control if the areas proposed within the next 6 months, 12 months after the law, are enough to provide space for the the objective for renewable production over until 2030, 2050. If that's the case, then the areas will be approved. If that's not the case, we go back to the municipalities. But the big point of those areas here is not environmental protection. It is much more acceptability at the local level. And this is one of the issues we have with this law. It's much more a law of participation of local municipalities and population, much more than environmental protection, of course, and acceleration of projects also. On the solar side, it could be even more damaging, that because it's not that we'll have a map on France on where you can put solar project, but you are supposed, there is a specific plan for solar project. You have to identify in each department, you have to identify the land that can host projects, solar on ground, mostly solar on ground projects. And what the law says is, if we are here dealing with, of course, facilities, I mean solar plants, that are compatible with agriculture. Agriculture is the biggest thing, the biggest issue for the French development of solar. And so you have to identify those lands for to host projects that will be compatible with agriculture. But the law also says that you can only identify in those lands that are unfit for agriculture, which is quite surprising and I mean almost irrelevant. If this is a category of project compatible with agriculture, you don't put land that are unfit for agriculture. It's a bit surprising. So unfit, and also lands that will not have any agricultural activity for over a certain time, that will be set in a decree. And that's one of the things of the law. We are waiting for application decrees, which will lead to big discussions between the solar producers, the lobbies, and the government here. And this is within the next few months. So you identify only lands that will be possible for project to be developed. It's a big limitation. It will be. It's not enforced today, of course, but it will be over the next few months. It's a big limitation of possibilities for projects to be developed on the land use, as you mentioned. And it's could be a bit surprising in a law of acceleration of renewable production. In this law, we also have provisions that are more positive, like the possibility to implement projects around highways. There is in France a legislation that forbids you to build anything around within 100 meters around highways. There is now a new exemption for especially solar projects. There is also new possibilities to use in communes that are around the sea. It was impossible to develop projects in those communes. It is now possible, but it's only a very limited possibility on industrial sites of those communes. But the biggest part, again, is agriculture here. The law, and this is the second point on this issue, the law creates two different categories in the town planning code. You now have a clear agri-PV project. You are agri-PV project if your project participate in the agriculture operation. For those projects, you can put those projects on all the agricultural land you want. The issue will be how you define them. The law is rather positive on this, clearly, but we are waiting for the application decree. Your project needs to again participate to the agriculture activity directly, and you have to prove this to be qualified as agri-PV project. On the other hand, you have a second category, which will be, as I mentioned earlier, the projects that are compatible with agriculture. And for those projects, as I mentioned, it will only be possible on the type of lands that will be identified in the departmental plan that must be approved within the next 6-12 months. And of course, this plan will be approved by the prefect, but proposed by the agricultural services. So it will be we will have it's a debate that has like 15 years in France. It started in 2009 when we got the first decree on solar in France, submitting project to the town planning under the town planning provisions. You've got circular that said you need to be careful with solar project, and of course on-ground solar project. With agricultural activity 15 years later, it's still exactly the same problem, and actually it results in a limitation of projects. So you've got two different type of projects with a definition in the town planning code: agri-PV projects and project that must be compatible with agriculture. And you also have provisions on the modalities of those projects. And what can be surprising here, another surprise of this law, and not a very good one. As I mentioned, you have a precise definition of the type of project that will be allowed. So you could say, okay, it's an agri-PV project. It's actually a good project because it's first agriculture, so it is completely relevant on agricultural lands. And second one, project compatible with agriculture. So in both cases, it should be good project, but still there are very harsh conditions for those projects. For example, there is a new provision still in the law of 10 March 2023. Now the permits that will be granted for those projects will have a limitation for the duration. You will only be able to operate those projects for a few years. We wait for the decree, the application decree for the maximum duration. It could be 20, 25, maybe 30 years. We will see, but it's a bit surprising to put a limit to a project that is either agri-PV project or that which would be compatible with agricultural activity. And of course, and especially for agri-PV project, there is also a provision that says that if you lose your agricultural activity below the project, you have to dismantle it. The question is, how can I finance a project for 15 or 20 years if there is a risk of dismantlement because I lose the operator on site and I can find one? Again, we wait for the decrees for the application of the law, but it raises big questions here. And also, for the last part, the law, so it opens a few lands, but it also limits, we talked about agriculture, there is also a limit in this law for forest. Now, and this is more environmental than agriculture. You have now, it is forbidden to a solar project which result in a forest clearing of more than 25 hectares or forbidden. So if it's lower, you could obtain your forest clearing authorization. If it's over 25 hectares, you will not get any permits. So we heard from the minister, because it was an amendment proposed by the parliament. The ministers from the government supported it, and we heard like, okay, we opened the project on agriculture, so now we limit them on forest. But when you see how they opened it on agriculture, it's a bit difficult to hear.
Yes, thanks, Francois. Well, first of all, thank you for your elaborate answer. And I think it's quite obvious and clear that it's rather a complex topic. And unfortunately, we don't have too much time to dive into in more details and assess it a little bit more. But I'm sure we might be able to tackle it maybe in the Q&A session. But it was quite useful to just hear from the legal perspective on such a law, such as the one on acceleration of renewable energy that's been now is working on in France, and just hearing what are the pros and cons of such regulation, and also giving a bit of the perspective on specifically on the agricultural land that you already mentioned. So quite useful and quite interesting. So thank you for that. But just being wary of the time, I'll move on forward to Valentine, to you, because I'd also like to hear about a bit the solar industry's perspective, and just having a bit of your opinion on what do you think, how does solar industry perceive the designation of areas for solar PV? And in more particularly, what are the opportunities and challenges of spatial planning? And do you think this tool can support or in turn hinder the allocation of suitable areas for solar deployment?
Yes, thank you, Lina, for this very large question. I will try to answer it as shortly as possible. But actually, you were mentioning risks and opportunities. So let me just take a step back here and maybe focus on the first opportunity that we are facing right now, is that for the first time now, and finally, European Union is giving us concrete measures to accelerate the deployment of renewable, which I think is very important, because I mean, we've been waiting for this for a while now, and let's say that maybe Solar Power Europe works finally paid off, I'm guessing, but yeah, it is a great news, and it is a great opportunity for the industry, definitely. But now that pretty much everybody is convinced that we need this acceleration, one risk that we need to address priorly, and probably the first risk, is the risk of a sudden and unplanned deployment of solar projects, because this would lead to a problem of acceptability that Penny was mentioning earlier. And in the long term, I think this problem of acceptability would clearly challenge our 45 renewable energy target for 2030. So in this sense, clearly, I think that the text that is proposed by the Commission is pretty smart, because it's taking this acceleration need into account, and then it proposes different type of areas and way to structure our PV projects. Some areas where PV project can be easily and quickly implemented, and maybe some other areas where we might need to take, let's say, a closer look to make sure that our projects are really useful and beneficial for the territory. So I really think this is going in the right way. Although sometimes the details are important, and we saw it in Francois' speech. It was really interesting, because the details are very important, and I think we have to really closely monitor three aspects, maybe some others, but I wanted to stress out the three aspects that I find very important to monitor in the way that the EU text will be implemented in the member states. First one is pretty basic but and obvious, but so important, which is time and resources. Because in theory, member states are given 6 months to implement this spatial planning, but we saw it in what François was presenting for France, but also for so many other member states. It's gonna take so much longer. It is obvious, we already know this. And during this time, our project will not be assessed because the people who are working on this planning are also the services that are working in assessing our project. So unless we give the right resources corresponding to the objective that we have, we will not succeed in this acceleration. And this is really a very important point to me. A second point that is as much important, I guess, is the very high risk of speculation that I foresee in those areas, because if let's say very frankly, at some point, developers have to make a little bit of money. So if they have a risk of speculation and the land that they will be using to develop their project is higher, they will either develop a lower quality project, and this is a very big problem. We saw it in what Carla said earlier, or make the electricity price for consumer higher, which we clearly don't want in the time being, obviously. So this is the second very important risk I wanted to stress out. And the third one is I foresee is probably the risk of depriving a project of a credible public approval and consensus on their development. And for instance, I know that the Commission is thinking of having this and considering and implementing this silent means agreement, which basically is to say that if you don't hear from the administration for a certain period of time, then your project gets automatically approved. And to me, this can be risky because technically, politically, and in terms of image, Penny mentioned it earlier, this can be a real risk for the project acceptance. And I think that we really need to find ways to quickly reward high quality project. And this actually makes the connection to the first point I was raising and the need of resources in public administration to assess our project and to really go through with this acceleration while rewarding best-in-class solar projects.
No, thanks, Valentine. Thank you for explaining us a bit more of your or the solar developer's perspective, and maybe also a bit explaining what is the reality actually of such regulations and what does it mean or what the impact is going to leave on the different developers or the solar industry. So I think that's quite useful. Quite insightful to also hear a bit of these potential risks. So not only focusing on opportunities, but also looking at the potential risks on the ground. So thank you for that. I'm just being quite wary of the time. We have left around 5 to 7 minutes for the last questions before we're moving to the Q&A session. So I'm just gonna kindly ask all the panelists to briefly sum up the answers to the last questions so we can move forward and move forward to the Q&A session. So since now we've already discussed a bit more on both what are the different quality projects on the ground, but also discussing a bit on the spatial planning, designation of the areas and a bit of the acceleration of renewable energy deployment and the law that comes with it. I'd like to use the last part of the panel discussion and gather a bit of your views, a bit more on the social acceptance of solar PV projects that we already a bit touched upon, and maybe a bit more looking at a bit more on how can we actually streamline these well-designed solar PV projects that could potentially give us the higher acceptance of the solar projects. So I'm just going to quickly go through, Francoise, to you, and looking again from the experience on the ground, from the legal perspective, could you shortly elaborate on what potentially can cause a litigation against solar PV projects? And is there anything you think that can be done towards mitigating the lawsuits that go against the solar projects?
A claim against solar project, it's not the biggest renewable energy challenge in France. This is clearly onshore wind for sure, and also offshore wind. But solar, we have seen an increase of claim and litigation against solar projects, especially very big projects that can be challenged, notably through environmental issues. But also for smaller projects, this is mostly acceptance, and the claim we have are usually filled by neighbors of those projects, and even not only for on-ground, I would say, standard project, but also for agri-PV project. When you have a big construction with solar panels, it can result in claim from neighbors afraid of losing with a decrease of their house price. To deal with it, so the government, there is not a huge possibility, I mean, from the legal standpoint, to limit the possibility of neighbors to challenge project. The governments found something last year in 2022. In October 2022, they decided to accelerate the duration of the litigation process before the judge. Now, tribunals and courts of appeal must render decision within 10 months, which is very quick as compared to the usual 18, 24, or 30 months of duration of each litigation. But I would say that to limit claims, as it mostly comes from neighbors, this is an issue of acceptability of the project. And actually, in the law of 10 March 2023, in the project presented by the government, there was a provision that provided the possibility to reduce the prices paid by neighbors around onshore renewable project. Unfortunately, this has been something that the lobbies has been, and associations for wind and even solar have been requesting for several years. It was in the first initial law presented by the government, but it was deleted. This provision was deleted by the Senate during the discussion, and unfortunately, we don't have this capacity to say, okay, you accept the project, and it will result in a reduction of your electricity bill. But we hope that we'll get it later. It's still possible in the next law.
Thanks, Francois. Thanks for elaborating a little bit on this. And now, again, quickly moving maybe to Valentine, to you. So having now heard from Francois that there actually can be the litigations, and quite often we have these litigations going against the solar projects. I wonder, from your perspective, how can we normalize nature-positive PV parks and ensure the quality of solar projects on the ground that could potentially then perhaps even minimize the litigations and have a wider acceptance of solar projects?
Yeah. Honestly, considering everything that has been said in this discussion today, I would say that it is really the IPP own interest to develop those best possible projects, because I mean, honestly, we know how to do it. You saw it in you saw it in Penny presentation at ACWO. We've been doing agrivoltaics for 15 years now, and I mean, we know how to make, like, for example, food and energy production compatible. This is something that we know, and we actually really much welcome the French initiative that Francois was describing earlier of giving a referential for agrivoltaics, because it helps us to align to this referential. And as we are in a more and more competitive field and industry, this kind of referential also pushes us to go further and to innovate. Just to give you the example for our agrivoltaics projects now, and as much as for our floating PV project, now we are very much focusing on how we can highly contribute with those projects to save water. So this is something new, something that pushes us further, because it will differentiate us from our competitors. And as we were mentioning before, the lands are very rare and we need them. So we need to differentiate from our competitors to get those projects. So really, I think this kind of practice to give referential and to make this the basis and to push developers to go further by innovating is clearly a way and a nice way to impulse nature positive projects.
Thanks, Valentine. Thanks for your answer. Now, maybe quickly towards Penny. Do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, very quickly, just to build on what Valentine was saying, I agree with her in terms of it's really helpful to have regulations. And if I specifically look at the biodiversity side of things, a good example is Spain, where they are now requiring environmental and social scorecards to be able to submit for the capacity auctions for the grid. That puts everyone on a level playing field. Everyone knows that they have to be doing something to achieve on those scorecards. Or when I was talking about before in England, where you've got the Biodiversity Net Gain regulations coming in, again, everyone's got a minimum baseline that they need to achieve. So things like that mean that everyone's at least having to have the same kind of baseline. And so you then don't view it as additional costs, it's just the cost of doing business.
Thanks, Penny. And maybe lastly, Carla, any remarks to add on your end?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of things were already said. I would just like to highlight that the energy transition as a whole cannot be a top-down approach. It has to be bottom-up and it has to be community-driven first. So stakeholder engagement means to be at every part and every step of the process. For example, our partner in the UK, RSPB, did sort of a set of town halls across the UK to develop a people's plan for nature. I mean, this doesn't directly relate to energy, but you could sort of repeat that for other topics as well, so that you really give the power to the people in this regard and make sure that they really understand what the benefits are for them for the energy transition as a whole. I mean, you're never going to convince everyone. So in the next step, you need to ensure that you have the capacity to deal with any sort of issues that come along, to make sure you have the capacity within governments and whatever authorities are in charge of these processes. But you know, at a first step, you really have to make sure that it's a bottom-up approach.
Lovely. Thanks, Carla. Again, being a bit wary of the time, we're going to jump right into the Q&A session, and we received quite a lot of questions. So I'm a bit concerned that we're not going to be able to go through of them, but we're just going to try to tackle as many as we can. Now, maybe just looking at the first two questions, which are addressed maybe to you, Penny, and I'm just going to read out both of them and then see how much of the time you have to answer them. So the first one is, what has been the cost of integrating the biodiversity initiatives compared of the project total capex? And could you also expand a little on the business case for the work you are doing on biodiversity loss?
Sure. So I don't have a specific figure to hand. And like I was saying earlier, it's quite difficult to actually divorce that from what the capex would be if you did nothing, because most of our projects require us to do some sort of environmental protection and habitat enhancement. And so for us to achieve a biodiversity net gain, sometimes it's just about how you tweak things or go a bit beyond that. But a lot of it in terms of that monitoring and implementation is part of our standard business as usual anyway. So challenging to answer. And in terms of the business case, I think I talked about that earlier. So it's about, you know, more likelihood to get permitting, more likelihood to get councils and communities supporting your projects, building on your positive reputation as a responsible developer, selling to PPA off-takers, things like that.
Yeah, thanks, Penny. The next question we have is addressed to you, Carla, and the question is, do you observe reduction of panel efficiencies due to pollen dust on the panels? If yes, how is this managed? And I don't know if you can answer that, but I guess that could also be answered perhaps by the solar developers as well.
Yeah, I'm probably the wrong person to ask. I'm aware that covering the surface of a solar panel will probably result in reduction of energy produced. So I think that's something that you know, we in general we are aware of this as an issue, and then you have to be able to you know, approach that in the design of and either the design of the solar park or in the how you manage it retrospectively, to make sure that you can clean off the panels after, you know, pollinating times or whatever in that matter. I personally believe that that's something that could be managed, but again, I'm not a solar farm developer, so maybe someone else can answer in more detail. I think yeah.
No, indeed. Thanks, Carla. And now I'm maybe looking at Penny or Valentine, at you, if you have any additional elements on this.
I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, I think there's going to be pollen in the environment no matter what you do in terms of habitat creation. So from my perspective, you're not going to be creating so much more pollen that it would change your cleaning regime. I'm not sure if Valentina has more to add to that.
Yeah, no, I was about to say approximately the same thing. Like, I mean, when we start a project, as we operate it, we know that we will have to operate it for 40 years probably. So obviously we will have this kind of issue, and this is something that our teams that manage and operates the plants can deal with. And pollen is one thing, but globally cleaning the panels is a global thing. So it's not a problem. And again, we need to have projects that benefits to the territories and to make sure that they're really integrated in their territories, because we are there for 40 years and because we need public acceptance for our industry. So this is technical problem, but that can't be unsolved, you know.
No, indeed. And thanks, Valentine. The next question we have, I think it's also addressed more to you, Penny and Valentine. And the question is, how would you tackle the long-term monitoring of multiple species groups for solar parks that are sometimes higher than 300 hectares in size? Are you worried that things could be missed or incorrectly conducted, which could then have huge consequences for biodiversity, given the scale of the works and resultantly huge landscape change? Oh, maybe Penny, if we can start with you.
Sure. I'm not sure I understand really the question, because from my perspective, it would be the site surveys before construction that would really determine what kind of impacts there might be. And you hire ecologists, they know what seasons to go out, and they go and assess the site, and they'll just be out there for a much longer time if it's a bigger site. And for monitoring, again, it's they can that oh, sorry, I'm just not entirely sure what the question is. Sorry.
No, don't worry. I guess it's more focused on whether there'll be different issues in terms of monitoring large spaces of solar PV projects whenever we're doing these biodiversity assessments. But I assume you already answered the question by saying that, you know, you're going to have to do the survey and do the plan design before even starting the monitoring.
Yeah, exactly. So you would hope that we're working with ecologists who can create a plan for that. I'm not one, so that's probably why I'm struggling with the question.
No, don't worry. But I hope that answered the question to the one who have asked it. If not, feel free to rewrite it in the Q&A box again. But moving on to maybe the next question. Again, I think this is more tailored to you, Penny and Valentine. So the question is, are solar company project investors or shareholders insisting on strong biodiversity elements in project proposals and business plans? And do solar companies see real opportunity for utility scale projects in transport corridors, so such as road or rail and transport hubs? Maybe we can this time start with Valentine, with you.
Yeah, sorry, Elena, I'm very sorry about this. I had a small connection problem, but I think and I didn't have the question, so I think you mentioned the importance of biodiversity for utilities.
Yeah, let me just, I can reread it again. So the
Yeah,
first question
sorry.
is, are solar company project investors or shareholders insisting on strong biodiversity elements in project proposals and business plans?
Yeah, definitely. This is a very important assessment in the way we finance our project. Okay, at Accrual, we have a specific way of financing a project. Our project is not the only company that does it, but we find the money for every project. We are not a huge player like other competitors, so we need to find money every time. And every time we have to justify the impact that our project will have. And clearly our investors are getting more and more cautious to the way we are dealing with biodiversity issues, and it is clearly differentiating us. It is true for public institutions and financiers, but it is also true for private banks, clearly.
No, that's all clear. And maybe then going right to the second question, in your opinion, do solar companies see real opportunities for utility scale projects in transport corridors such as road or rails, and transport hubs such as large buildings at train stations, airports, marine ports, etc.? Maybe Valentin, going straight for you again.
I don't know. I think maybe Penny has an answer to this one, so we can.
Sure. I would say we're not massively excited about those prospects in terms of, you know, actually getting projects that will work in those situations. But, you know, let's see. But yeah, it doesn't have us excited.
Right, that's clear. Thanks, Penny. Maybe then moving on, I have two questions for Carla. One of them is if you could tell us where we can find more information about nature-friendly energy transition, and whether there is a big price difference in installing a PV park on, for example, a stored peatland in comparison to a normal land.
So the first question on the nature-friendly energy transition, I would advise you to check out, well, the land use and biodiversity report that we did together with Solar Power Europe. It's all technologically specific as well. I mean, the nature-friendly energy transition for solar will look slightly different than from wind. RSPB has recently done a really great report on nature positive wind energy transition in the UK, and NABU of course has their position on nature-friendly solar, and BirdLife Europe has also done their work. So I don't know what region you're in or what language you would prefer, but those would be resources that I would recommend. And if not, of course we can also, you can contact me, and we can give you a bit more information on this. I think it's a bit hard to elaborate on this in this setting now. Oh, and the second one, sorry. Again, I think that's more a question for a project developer on the cost of. I would imagine that building on a peatland, since it's not necessarily a stable underground, would probably cost a bit more. I do have an example though from the solar parks that I mentioned in my presentation. The one that was built over that had to do with rewetting of wetlands, they actually witnessed that because of the dual-sided panels that they implemented in that area, that they actually produced more electricity because of the reflection from the water surface. So that's not a pre-cost, but it's also you're generating more given the surface that you have underneath. So I think that's also something to take into account. And again, on the price, I'm sorry that I really can't answer that.
No worries, and thanks, Carla. Looking at maybe Penny or Valentin, would you have any sort of assumption or answer to whether there's a big price difference if we install PV parks on like restored peatlands or normal land areas? Maybe Penny, I would start with you.
I don't know, sorry.
Don't worry. And Valentina, any add-on?
Sorry, I can't answer either. I'm very sorry about it.
No worries. Okay,
You muted yourself, Lena.
Lina, I'm very sorry, but you are muted.
Thank you. Just realized that, but thanks. I was just recapping and saying that unfortunately we're already running out of the time and I'm gonna have to stop the Q&A session here. But nevertheless, Penny, Carla, Valentina, and Francoise, many thanks for joining us here today and for providing this very insightful discussion. Also, thank you to the audience for having your interest in the topic and for asking all of your questions. So to all the participants, in case we didn't answer your questions or didn't get to your questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to provide more information and discuss the topic further. Again, you will find our report, Solar Biodiversity and Land Use, on our webpage, which we have linked in the Q&A box. And thank you again for joining us today. And I wish all the panelists and participants a lovely Thursday and a good end of the week. Thanks again.
Thank you.